$300 million in gold vanished at a European port, not stolen by pirates, not delayed by storms, but seized under pressure from Washington. A shipment mined from Burkina Faso soil, meant for schools, hospitals, and bread on the tables of its people, was transformed into collateral for debts written in foreign capitals. And then came the voice of Donald Trump, blunt and unapologetic. If Africa wants access to global markets, it must pay its dues. For the people of Ouagadougou, it was not trade. It was daylight robbery. What was meant to be the foundation of their future became the ransom of their past. But where humiliation might have broken a leader, it instead lit a fire. Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of a landlocked nation, refused to bow. What began as the loss of a single shipment was about to ignite a continental struggle over sovereignty itself. Do not turn away. What follows may reshape Africa's place in the world. Subscribe and stay with us. It began with silence, the kind of silence that falls when the unthinkable has happened. Containers of gold mined in Burkina Faso were stopped at a European port, their seals unbroken, their journey unfinished. Officials spoke of regulation, of compliance, of paperwork. But everyone in Ouagadougou knew the truth. This was not bureaucracy. This was power. Under the shadow of Washington's influence, the cargo was frozen in place. And above the noise of diplomacy came a voice that could not be mistaken. Donald Trump. His words cut like iron. If Africa wanted to sit at the table of global markets, it must first pay its dues. $300 million in gold was no longer the property of a sovereign state. It was collateral, held hostage against debts written decades before by regimes that no longer ruled. Debts inked under colonial terms that had already drained more than they had ever given. To the West, it was policy. To the people of Burkina Faso, it was theft. Crowds poured into the streets. From the radios of the capital to the loudspeakers in village squares, the message was repeated until it thundered in every ear. Gold seized, nation betrayed. At the heart of this betrayal stood a young leader. President Ibrahim Traoré, whose very name was still unfamiliar in many foreign chancelleries, understood that the wound was not about money. It was about sovereignty. Before his cabinet, he spoke plainly. This was not debt. This was control. And if Africa allowed this precedent to stand, tomorrow there would be nothing left to own. Ministers exchanged uneasy glances. Some urged negotiation, schedules of repayment, compromise. But others shook their heads. Traoré's calm voice silenced the chamber. They want us to bend. They want us to bow with gold mined by our own blood. If we surrender now, there will be no tomorrow to fight for. The streets outside echoed his words. Miners marched from the goldfields carrying their tools high, not as instruments of labor, but as banners of defiance. Students staged sit-ins at universities, demanding that their nations sever ties with the IMF altogether. Mothers in the market shouted over the price of bread, asking aloud whether the gold belonged to them or to foreigners who had never tilled their soil. A farmer, his hands still caked in earth, put it most simply on local radio. We never signed those loans. Why should our children pay them with their future? The seizure, far from quieting the nation, lit a fuse. For years, Africa's debts had been tied to contracts written in Washington and Paris. For years, the IMF had demanded repayment in dollars backed by guarantees. And now, as Burkina Faso and its neighbors sought new partners in BRICS and India, the West had grown anxious. What if those debts were simply abandoned? What if Africa chose to walk away? Trump's answer was unambiguous. Hold the gold, freeze the reserves, make Africa kneel before it rises. But in Ouagadougou, his lesson was heard differently. It was not a warning. It was a challenge. The media played its part. Western headlines framed the episode as instability, as recklessness, as yet another African crisis. But on the streets of Burkina Faso, the narrative was transforming. People did not see recklessness. They saw resistance. They saw dignity. And dignity, once awakened, is not easily silenced. From chants in public squares to whispered conversations in homes, a single truth was taking root. Africa's wealth could no longer be entrusted to foreign hands. If the seizure had been meant to humiliate, it had instead forged unity. By the end of the week, the walls of Ouagadougou were covered in slogans. Murals showed gold bars chained to Western banks, broken open by the hands of African workers. Youth painted banners declaring, "Our gold is not your guarantee." The nation was no longer mourning a loss. It was preparing for a fight. For in the silence of those seized containers lay a message sharper than any decree. What began as one shipment stopped at a port was about to ignite a battle that stretched far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. What began as one shipment seized was about to ignite a continental fire. The silence that had gripped Ouagadougou broke into thunder. Protesters surged through the capital, not with confusion but with fury. This was not a storm brought by nature. It was a storm stirred by men in foreign suits, and its lightning struck deep. Miners, with dust still clinging to their faces, carried their tools as if they were weapons. Students staged sit-ins across universities, chanting that Burkina Faso must sever its dependency on the IMF. Mothers in markets, who had long struggled to buy bread, shouted in unison, "Ours or theirs?" The question needed no answer. The gold had been stolen in daylight, under the banner of law. The presidential palace was no less turbulent. Ministers argued late into the night. Some urged diplomacy. "Offer repayment schedules," they whispered. "Compromise before sanctions tighten further." But in the corner of the room, others shook their heads. The air was thick with unease until Ibrahim Traoré stood. His voice was calm, but every syllable cut. "They want us to bow," he said. "They want us to pay debts we did not choose with gold mined by our blood. If we bend today, we will have nothing left tomorrow." The words hung heavy in the chamber, silencing even the most cautious. Outside those walls, the protests grew into something larger. Miners marching from the goldfields were joined by farmers carrying baskets of grain, declaring their harvest would not be collateral for foreign banks. Students painted slogans on walls calling not for negotiation, but for liberation. In the barracks, soldiers muttered, "If they can seize gold, what will they seize next?" The nation was uniting, not breaking. What had begun as outrage was becoming resolve. Western media framed it differently. CNN spoke of instability. European commentators painted Traoré as reckless, too young, too dangerous. But in Africa, the story was shifting. He was no longer a president caught in crisis. He was a symbol of defiance. His courage was echoed in villages, towns, and cities. For the first time, Burkina Faso's struggle was seen not as an isolated grievance, but as a continental wound. It was in this moment that the alliance of Sahel states, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, convened an emergency session in Ouagadougou. The hall buzzed with anger and fear in equal measure. Each delegate carried stories of humiliation, uranium shipments delayed, reserves frozen, contracts rewritten by foreign pens. The seizure of Burkina Faso's gold was not an accident. It was a strategy. And the strategy was clear. Africa's wealth would remain in foreign hands for as long as the IMF controlled the rules. Traoré's words echoed once more, this time not to his cabinet but to his fellow leaders. "They call it collateral. I call it ransom. And if we accept this ransom today, it will never end." The room fell silent. Then a minister from Mali broke it with a thought so radical it drew gasps. What if we stopped sending gold through their ports? What if we kept it here, in Africa? Heads turned. For the first time, the impossible began to feel inevitable. An African gold reserve, built and guarded on African soil, out of the reach of Paris, Brussels, or Washington. The idea spread beyond the hall. Protesters carried new slogans: "Keep the gold, build the vault." Youth groups painted murals of gold bars breaking chains. Farmers pledged contributions to a people's fund, ready to back financial independence with their harvest. What the West dismissed as fantasy was quickly becoming a movement. European officials scoffed. "They do not have the infrastructure," they said. "They do not have the unity." But they underestimated Africa's greatest resource: determination. In the streets, chants of "Our gold, our Africa" grew louder with each passing day. In homes, families spoke of sacrifice, of a tomorrow built not on debt but on dignity. The momentum was no longer contained within Burkina Faso. It was spreading like fire across the Sahel, lighting a path towards a future no one had dared to imagine. For the first time, the unthinkable was on the table, an African reserve beyond foreign reach. The seizure of gold was meant to humble a nation. Instead, it transformed daily life into a battleground of dignity. In Ouagadougou's markets, bread sellers raised their voices above the noise, declaring that every coin spent was now an act of resistance. Mothers told their children that the flour in their hands was not bought with aid, but with sacrifice. At schools, teachers explained to restless students that the future of Burkina Faso was not written in textbooks imported from abroad, but in the struggle unfolding outside their classroom walls. The streets were no longer simply filled with protesters. They were filled with citizens redefining themselves. The farmers pledged to contribute grain to a communal reserve that would one day replace loans. Students organized vigils at universities, holding candles for a generation whose future was being mortgaged by debts they had never signed. In the goldfields, miners worked with new purpose. No longer, they said, would their sweat be for the enrichment of foreign banks. Every ounce dug from the soil was to be counted as a step toward liberation. This shift was more than symbolic. Politically, the government of Burkina Faso found itself at a crossroads. Ministers who once argued for cautious negotiation now admitted that the ground beneath them had changed. To speak of compromise was to risk being drowned out by chants echoing through the streets. Even the military, often the final arbiter in fragile states, issued statements of support. Their loyalty, they declared, was to the people and to the republic, not to contracts signed in Paris or Washington. It was here that whispers of Ibrahim Traoré's defiance began to be called something more dangerous by Western diplomats. An Ibrahim Traoré coup against the financial order. For decades, the IMF had been the gatekeeper of Africa's economic destiny, setting conditions that shaped entire nations. To reject its terms was, in their eyes, to rebel not just against debt, but against the architecture of global finance itself. But to the people of Burkina Faso, this was no coup. It was the first honest claim to sovereignty and living memory. The consequences were immediate. International banks froze lines of credit. Insurance companies refused to cover shipments leaving West Africa. Cargo bound for Asia was stopped for inspections, slowing the very trade that might have offered relief. Humanitarian aid convoys were delayed under the pretext of review. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would be punished not only with words but with hunger. Yet the nation did not break. On radio stations across the Sahel, callers repeated the same refrain. If they can seize gold, they can seize anything. Better to starve with dignity than to live forever on our knees. This refrain did not erase hardship. Families still struggled to find fuel, to pay for medicine, to keep children in school. But the hardship itself was reframed. Each empty shelf became proof of sacrifice. Each delay at the border became evidence that the old order feared change. In this crucible, a new kind of politics was forged. Traoré no longer spoke only as a president managing crisis. He spoke as a voice of resistance, drawing lines not between parties or factions, but between dignity and submission. His speeches carried metaphors drawn from the land itself. They sow with our soil, he said, but they never reap with our hands. The imagery resonated deeply. Across Burkina Faso, murals appeared, showing seeds breaking through chains, harvests guarded by African hands. Neighboring nations watched closely. Some leaders hesitated, fearing sanctions that could strangle their own fragile economies. But in towns along the borders, ordinary people expressed solidarity. Traders in Mali whispered that their uranium was as much a hostage as Burkina Faso's gold. Farmers in Niger wrote slogans on sacks of grain. Not collateral, but our children's bread. What was once a national crisis was becoming a regional awakening. The risk, however, was real. With each act of defiance, the economic noose tightened. Prices rose. Imports slowed. Foreign investors quietly withdrew. The choice was stark: retreat into compromise or leap into the unknown. Traoré chose the latter, betting not on guarantees from abroad, but on the unyielding will of his people. And so the question lingered, echoing in homes and ministries alike. If gold could unite the streets, could it also redraw Africa's future? If gold could unite the streets, could it also redraw Africa's future? Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the gold seizure reverberated like a drumbeat across diplomatic halls. In Addis Ababa, the African Union issued statements urging calm, wary of escalation, but careful not to appear aligned with the West. ECOWAS, already fractured by competing loyalties, warned of regional instability if nations attempted to bypass international systems. In Brussels and Paris, officials were blunter. They spoke of compliance, of order, of law. But in private memos, unearthed by whistleblowers, the words were sharper. Without control of their gold, IMF leverage will collapse. Washington played its hand openly. Donald Trump stood before cameras declaring that young leaders in the Sahel must first learn to follow the law if they wish to join global trade. To him, the law meant IMF contracts and the supremacy of the dollar. Anything else was chaos. Western media amplified the message. Headlines called the African Gold Reserve Plan a reckless gamble. Commentators painted Ibrahim Traoré as a populist too dangerous to trust with a nation's future. Yet outside the West, the reaction was starkly different. In Moscow and Beijing, officials followed every twist with calculated interest. In New Delhi, emissaries signaled readiness to purchase gold directly, offering markets that would not bow to Washington's pressure. Within weeks, delegations from BRICS arrived in Ouagadougou with proposals: refining technology, secure storage infrastructure, and direct trade routes that bypassed European ports. To African ears, these offers were not charity. They were partnership. For decades, Burkina Faso had been a supplier of raw materials, sending its wealth abroad only to receive it back as debt. The gold seizure revealed the fragility of that system. But the reaction of the BRICS nations revealed something else. Alternatives existed. And in those alternatives lay the seeds of a possible Burkina Faso revolution. What the West dismissed as fantasy was, in the eyes of Africa's new partners, a strategic shift waiting to be nurtured. Still, risk multiplied. European regulators announced tighter trade restrictions. Banks in Paris froze transactions linked to Sahel states. Cargo ships bound for Asia were detained for inspection. It was economic warfare disguised as compliance. Yet every sanction seemed to deepen African resolve. Students posted viral messages online. If they fear it this much, then it must be our only hope. The more the West condemned, the more legitimacy the project gained at home. For the first time in a generation, African leaders were not reacting to instructions from abroad. They were drafting their own blueprint. What had begun as humiliation was turning into momentum. And momentum, once unleashed, is hard to stop. As sanctions tightened, new alliances whispered promises across continents. From the ashes of humiliation rose a vision bold enough to frighten empires. The African gold reserve was no longer a whisper in closed rooms. It was a blueprint, fragile yet alive. Engineers spoke of vaults to be carved into the heart of the Sahel, guarded not by foreign insurance but by African soldiers. Economists mapped pathways to pool reserves from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso into a joint stock, a foundation shielded from the claws of the IMF. What had once been dismissed as fantasy now appeared as survival. The road ahead was treacherous. Sanctions loomed like storm clouds. European insurers had already withdrawn. Banks had frozen assets. Ships bound for Asia were held at sea. The West believed this economic suffocation would starve resistance into silence. But it underestimated something less tangible yet far stronger: conviction. Every hardship faced by families became proof that the struggle was real. Every closed door pushed nations further toward building their own. Traore's voice captured this moment of transition. Before a small crowd of miners, he declared, "You are not digging for Paris. You are not digging for Washington. From now on, your work builds Africa's strength." The applause was thunderous, not because the reserve was built, but because the people had claimed ownership of the idea. Gold was no longer a commodity measured only in weight. It was a banner under which a continent could march. Yet unity demanded sacrifice. Some leaders cautioned against the dream. Without Western markets, exports might stall. Without international recognition, credit might vanish. But others argued that the greater danger was submission itself. Did the IMF feed Africa when reserves were frozen? Did sanctions protect children when hospitals lacked medicine? No, they drained with one hand and lent with the other. Enough. The proposal to store gold in Africa carried risks, but it also carried possibility. It promised a break from cycles of extraction, where Africa sent away raw wealth only to receive it back as debt. It offered the chance to transform gold from ransom into shield, from collateral into cornerstone. If realized, the reserve could mark the first step toward a future in which Africa negotiated not from weakness, but from strength. The question lingered, heavy with both hope and fear. Could the seed of unity sown in Ouagadougou withstand the storms ahead? Could an idea born in defiance grow roots deep enough to withstand the weight of sanctions, propaganda, and division? The road stretched before them, uncertain yet undeniable. But the harvest of this seed would depend on the courage to stand. What began as humiliation became a turning point. Burkina Faso did not recover its seized gold. But in losing it, the nation found something greater: the courage to imagine a different tomorrow. The gold was meant to be collateral, a ransom to secure debts written in foreign capitals. Instead, it became a symbol of unity. From the hands of miners to the chants of students, from the harvests of farmers to the speeches of leaders, a single truth took root. Africa's wealth must no longer be guarded in someone else's vault. The revelation of secret memos confirmed what millions already suspected. This was never about law, but about domination. And with that confirmation, the balance shifted. Ibrahim Traoré's defiance no longer looked like recklessness. It looked like dignity. His name, once little known beyond Ouagadougou, began to echo across the continent as a voice unwilling to bow. In his struggle, Africans saw their own. The consequences remain uncertain. Sanctions may tighten. Propaganda may deepen. Attempts to divide will not cease. Yet for the first time in generations, Africa is not only reacting to orders from abroad, It is writing its own chapter. The African gold reserve is still an idea, fragile and incomplete, but it has already achieved what no decree could. It has reminded millions that sovereignty is not given, it is claimed. This was never just about a shipment. It was about the right to decide. It was about the refusal to live forever on borrowed dignity. And as one farmer put it, with hands still scarred from labor, better to starve with freedom than to eat with chains. The world will remember this moment not as a simple dispute over metal, but as a seed planted in African soil. Whether that seed grows into a harvest will depend on courage, unity, and time. But its roots have already broken through. If you believe this fight for dignity matters, share the story. Subscribe, add your voice, and walk with us into the journey of an Africa that refuses to bow.